Hi, folks. So nice to see you. One last one here covering the end of our Unit 2 for AP US History. We have the Adams and Jefferson administrations here. So, what we're taking a look at today in particular is kind of the fallout of this new political party system that Washington warned us against and that no one listened to, but also kind of seeing how America appears during the world stage and how that role is appearing as America becomes a much more legitimate power in the Atlantic region. All right. So, first things first, let's take a look at the immediate successor to George Washington, Mr. John Adams. So, this was after Washington serves for 2 terms, he's going to peace out, he's going to retire, and that means that the election of 1796 is the first real competitive election where we actually do see a not clear path as to who's going to be the immediate president. Now, Adams was the vice president of George Washington, but we see that he is also a Federalist. And now that there is this other faction, the Democratic Republicans, they're going to run Thomas Jefferson, and we shall see exactly how it all shakes out. Adams will win, but off the bat, he has a lot of issues just because of the fact that he is uh, already less popular than Washington, simply just because he is not, the man, the myth, the legend himself. He is a little bit awkward, a little bit reclusive. He doesn't really know how to talk to people. As Mr. Antarsky shared in class, one of the nicknames he had was his rotundity. So he's, a short, fat guy who just has a lot of put on airs. So already he's less, given less of the benefit of the doubt. Now, in truth, it was a kind of neutral take on him as the immediate successor. And what ends up really shaping his presidency is something that leads to the foreign policy evolving very quickly. And that is going to involve something called the XYZ affair. Now, this is going to be a issue between the US and France. And we see that, as we saw earlier, a lot of countries weren't really taking us that seriously because we were just kind of weak and could be pushed around very easily. France was one of them. We see that the foreign minister, Mr. Talleyrand, he sent a couple delegates whose names were never revealed, X, Y, and Z, and they are going to basically just try and extort the United States government. They're going to tell our ambassador, John Marshall, that if they want to meet with Talleyrand, we must pay une décure, a sweetener, effectively a bribe. We got to pay these guys money if they if the U.S. wants the right to talk to Talleyrand. And so this extortion here, it shows that the French are not taking the U.S. government very seriously at all. And it is an insult to our national honor. And so Marshall is not going to pay that. He's going to and then go back and inform Adams about this. And really, Adams is going to take a heavy-handed approach here, where he's going to basically form up a U.S. Navy. And using that Navy, he's then going to try and fight back against this injustice in something known as the Quasi War. It's basically an undeclared war happening mostly at sea between between US and French ships. And so this is going to be just 2 years of just back and forth bickering. It'll eventually be resolved. But what this does show is it is the beginning of America starting to, one, build up a military force overseas with the Navy, but two, it is a sign that America is very much focused on its national honor. And that's going to be a much bigger deal later on. You'll see. Um, but yeah, we see that after the Quasi War and this idea of sticking up to the bullies, Adams has actually become very popular. And we see that that is going to be, unfortunately, undone very quickly due to some issues around the same time called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, these are some domestic policies that Adams passes, and they very much undo any of his presidency, any of the gains of his presidency. The Alien Act is basically going to make it harder to become a citizen and therefore to vote. And the reason is because, simplified, there are a lot of French people moving to America during the Revolution era and the war. And since the French are much more beloved by the Democratic Republicans, those people would be more likely to vote against Adams's party, the Federalists. And so, what is going to end up happening is Adams is going to basically be kind of abusing his power here to just basically weaken his political opponents and their voting bloc. And that is going to be commented on rightly by a couple different groups. And so he's going to counter with something called the Sedition Acts, basically declaring any criticism of the president to be illegal. And so what we see is that this two together, well, it's going to be very easy for the Democrat Republicans to just label this as tyranny, basically declaring that Adams is using his power. He's abusing his power and basically doing everything that the anti-federalists of old warned us about. And so the states' rights crowd, the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, they're going to counter with something called the Kentucky-Virginia resolves, also called the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions. The exact order doesn't exactly matter. But what this is going to argue is that the states are the ones who actually have the real power. They argue that any power the federal government has was given up by the states, and therefore they are the more legitimate source of power. The most important part of this resolution is it proposes a theory called nullification. Basically, it's the belief that if the states do not agree with a federal law, then they do not have to follow it. They can declare a federal law invalid. And again, the concept of the federal government being stronger or weaker than the states is very much in debate at this point in time. So, really, this was a theory that was being practiced, and it's going to be a very important precedent for the next couple presidencies, really until the Civil War, in fact. So, it shows that Adams is dealing with a lot of enthusiasm. He's at a historic low after this whole scandal. And then, just before you know it, we're at election time again. And so the election of 1800, it's going to be a convoluted mess. It will result in several hoops to jump through where Adams is going to, well, lose badly. He will end up eventually, after 36 ballots of a tie between Jefferson and Aaron Burr, we will see that Jefferson is going to become president. And the biggest result of this is what we call the bloodless revolution, where this is the first peaceful transfer of power anywhere in the world at this point to a rival faction. That's the important part. This is the first time an enemy group took power without some kind of bloodshed or war anywhere in the country. No, in the world. My mistake. So, truly, this shows that the American project, even though it is ugly and petty at times, it's working as intended. Democracy and the power of it is ensuing. So, with that in mind, let's take a look here at kind of what leads to the Jefferson presidency, because really, Jefferson is a very important figure for a lot of different reasons, kind of considered one of the more democracy loving founding fathers here. And so, with that in mind, we're going to look at something called Jeffersonian democracy. This is a good concept, especially comparing to future presidents, where Jefferson is going to promote a couple different beliefs. One, he is a fan of that Republican government. So again, not a full democracy, not tyranny of the mob, but certainly not tyranny of the crown either. We see that he is nonetheless going to be a big fan of a states' rights, limited federal government power, and he's going to try and use that Democratic Republican ideal as much as possible. How much is he going to follow that? Well, we'll see in a sec here. But yeah, he also believes in like strict constructionism. Again, follow the Constitution to the letter with no derivations. But also, the biggest things is he is a big believer in not manufacturing powers, but the yeoman farmer belief. If everyone just had a farm and grew stuff on that farm and was left alone, America would prosper. That's all we ever need. And lastly, perhaps the biggest thing, he is a big believer in meritocracy. No one got this position in his government just by being landed elite or being rich. People had to earn their power to some extent here. So, good ideals. And so, it's worth noting, especially that idea of agrarian systems, it is worth bringing up just because at this point in time already, by the time he takes office, we're starting to see a divide between North and South about how the economy runs. Basically, at this point in time, the South is very heavy on the agrarian lifestyle of just farming raw materials and then just selling those to other people like the North or other countries. Meanwhile, the northern economy is very much based on buying stuff from overseas, like British manufactured goods, and then just reselling them here. There's no real farmland in the north. So, this idea of promoting yeoman farmers, it is worth noting it's basically a promotion of the South. All right. Then, very briefly, we get into some historical interpretations of Jefferson's presidency. The progressives saw him as a defender of the yeoman farmer and therefore a defender of the common white man. So they liked him. We saw that the neocons, they saw all of these values, the Declaration, the philosophy, the support for public education, all of those things as well. He's just one of the best to ever do it. And yeah, even though he owned slaves, they're going to say, but he did put slavery on a path to gradual eradication. And meanwhile, the new left are going to see him as sort of, just a hypocrite, someone who promotes all these values of equality. But again, he owned slaves himself and was very choosy. Only people that he ever emancipated were direct children of his that he had through the relationships with slaves. And it's ugly. All right. So, actually, looking at the specifics of Jefferson's presidencies, he serves two terms, unlike Adams, and really looking at what happens first, we're going to see that there is a lot of different things that switch up here. His domestic policy is going to be a little bit unique. Again, because of the fact that the US is such a economic fragile state right now, we're going to see that he is going to kind of walk the line between his own party and the Federalist Party. He makes a declaration when he takes office that we're all Federalists and we're all Democrat Republicans. So he does some things to directly address some of the issues that he took issue with. Like he's going to get rid of the whiskey tax, again, hurts yeoman farmers. He's going to repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts, basically, the reason he did the Kentucky Virginia resolves in the first place. But he is going to keep Hamilton's national bank system because it's working. We see that the economy is indeed stabilizing. And so what that means is that really, for all that talk of all these different values, really he is kind of becoming a much more moderate, kind of centrist during his presidency right off the get-go. Um, Meanwhile, we're going to see that he thinks that the treaties that we have made, the Jay Treaty, the Pinckney Treaty, all of those different examples, they are improving relations with other countries. And so he's going to argue that because of these facts, we don't really need a navy at this point. And so he's going to downsize the navy that Adams built. Instead of having these big, colossal battleships, he's going to create those little tiny gunboats we showed in class, basically just a little rowboat with like one cannon. And he's going to say that's all we would really need to defend our home turf. No overseas hostilities or nothing like that. All right? Now, does that mean that he's a man of peace? Not exactly, because sadly, we do see that his Native American policy was quite harsh. Basically, a very paternalistic approach of if you're Native American, you have to either assimilate to white culture or be wiped out. And so it was very condescending, and there are countless examples of just disregard for negotiations under this presidency. However, perhaps the big win under the Jeffersonian first term is going to be the Louisiana Purchase. We see that we got the right of deposit in French-controlled New Orleans under the Pinckney Treaty. However, we do see that there is a big debate right now where we want that city because it's where the Mississippi River ends and is therefore a major port for this new American country. So we propose to Napoleon to buy New Orleans for $10 million. And Napoleon has just been spooked by the Haitian Revolution over in the West Indies. That really, between that and the threat of other possible uprisings, on top of needing money to fight all of Europe in the Napoleonic Wars, he's going to counter by saying, "Tell you what if I just give you all of the French territory in North America for $15 million?" And I mean, that's a ganga. That's a great deal right there. That's about 3 cents an acre. So Jefferson, despite there not being really any precedent for this, and again, this definitely not being in the Constitution, Jefferson is going to accept. And so, in just one fell swoop, the size of the country is going to nearly double. And we see it is a huge source now of land and territory, all to be explored by surveyors like Lewis and Clark, as well as more potential land to then be sold to raise taxes for the government, or just to really, I mean, to really expand into future territories here. So you could make the argument that although he is a strict constructionist by name, all of these, this being the most egregious one here of the Louisiana Purchase, he's going to just ignore the Constitution when he feels like it. So really, he's a Democrat Republican when he feels like it. He's a strict constructionist when he feels like it. All right. Whatever is best for the country, whenever it happens. All right. All right. So we see that he's going to get reelected. And what we start to see as well is during some of these other future issues, a couple other fallouts begin to appear. One, right around the time Adams was supposed to leave office, we see a scandal appear, something called the Midnight Appointments, where Adams is going to just write a bunch of approvals for a bunch of Federalist judges, sensing that the Democratic Republicans are about to take power. He wants to preserve the Federalist legacy in an institution where people can serve for a much longer term. And in particular, we see that a few of these are going to be thrown into doubt. One is going to be sued by a man named William Marbury, and he is going to be taking James Madison to court because Madison failed to actually approve this appointment here. And so what ends up happening is this court arrives in the Supreme Court. This suit arrives in the Supreme Court. And rather than decide one way or another of whether Marbury should actually get his appointment or not, the new Chief Justice, John Marshall, who is a Federalist, he is going to use this opportunity to kind of expand the powers of the Supreme Court significantly. And he's going to declare that, per his reading of the Constitution, he believes that the Supreme Court does not actually have any constitutional right to hear this case in the first place and is going to basically throw the whole thing out. So, why does that matter? Because really, with that interpretation of the Constitution and that verdict there, John Marshall has just invented a concept called judicial review. And that is a very important thing for really moving forward here. What this means now is that John Marshall has basically just declared that the Supreme Court, as the official interpreters of the Constitution, they now have a new check and balance on Congress. And what that means is that they can decide if a law is constitutional or not. And if they decide it is not, they can just strike down that law and render it completely invalid. This judicial review is a very powerful system, as we see in the modern day. And it is another great example of how the Supreme Court is going to give itself a lot of power moving forward. The judicial branch was given its base skeleton structure under Washington, but really, a lot of their abilities, they're going to decide for themselves. So Marbury v. Madison, a major development, and another example of the last Federalist, John Marshall, sticking it out in an era of Democratic Republicans that will last until the 20s, actually. Now, last couple things for Jefferson here, the big issues here are going to be some foreign policy stuff. And it's going to mean that even though Jefferson doubled the size of the country in his first term, really, he's going to be remembered as a bad president in the eyes of the people following the end of his second term. As Dr. Hosmer, the old English teacher, used to say, no president has two good terms. So we see that this whole time, the issue of impressment has really still been going on. And we see that one of the ways that manifests is through basically Napoleon trying to do something called the continental system. Basically, we see that this is going to be an attempt to try and blockade anyone from doing any trade with Britain. And Britain is going to respond in a similar vein with something called the Orders in Council. And so, what all of this means is that British ships are going to be trying to counter anyone from trading with France in a very similar way. And this means American ships are going to be raided and searched again. Impressment is continuing. In particular, we see the hostility is going to get even more aggressive with some notorious scandal near the in the middle of Jefferson's second term called the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. Basically, the U.S. ship Chesapeake is going to be searched by the British ship Leopard, except the British are going to demand, and the Americans are going to refuse to comply. They refuse to allow themselves to be searched. And without a word, the Leopard is going to open fire on the Chesapeake. They're going to shoot at the Chesapeake ship. And so this could have triggered an entire war again. And again, we've been trying to be very careful to avoid war with Britain, going back to like the Jay Treaty. If we go to war right now with Britain, we probably won't win. And so that was true back then, and even it's true now because again, we have the useless little gunboats here because Jefferson scrapped the whole navy. So, since we can't go to war, what we're going to do instead is basically something called the Embargo Act. And Jefferson's brilliant idea here is we are going to basically just not do trade with anyone. No country can trade with the United States. Genius. Now, despite sounding like a real boneheaded move, the philosophy here was that America provides enough raw materials to countries like Britain that they would feel the need for our stuff longer and sooner than we would feel the need for theirs. Basically, the idea was to kind of wait them out, especially because they're at war, and eventually they would cave and give us some kind of deal, and eventually we would, respond and everything would work out. Sadly, that does not work because this year Britain just happens to actually have a record-breaking harvest and doesn't need our raw materials and supplies. And so, really, this embargo act just tanks the economy, causes a massive depression, and it makes Jefferson look like an idiot. And so, in particular, it's so bad that there are actually political fallouts that happen from both factions here. We see that the one of them, the Democratic Republicans, they're going to form a group called the Tertium Quids, the third thing. And basically, they argue that Jefferson has lost the path, that he's a Democratic Republican in name only. And so, really, they're going to basically completely oppose Jefferson. And that's not even the worst one. The Federalists form a group called the Essex Junto, and they basically threaten to straight up secede from the Union because of all this a horrible economy and anti-federalist views. And so, really, the Embargo Act tanks Jefferson's reputation in politics. He's going to have to resign in disgrace. And one of the last things that we see is an attempted modification of this, where we see that the Non-Intercourse Act is passed. Basically, okay, we can trade with every country except for Britain and France. So that economic pressure strategy does not even work, especially because eventually Britain is going to repeal the Orders in Council on their own. So really, Jefferson tanked the economy for no good reason. And yeah, Jefferson is going to be a neat example of how someone can have very different values that they set out with and end up adapting in the face of the realities of the situation. So, Jefferson, a very consequential president in terms of the sheer amount of land he acquires and the developments within his cabinet, but he himself thinks he did a rather inadequate job. And again, he will actually write an entire biography of himself and never once is going to mention that he was president of the United States. So, the system is slowly working as intended. All right. And I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up there for now. So, if you have any questions about Adams or Jefferson, please talk to your teacher of record. And I hope that this helps. Take care, guys, and good luck for everything Unit 2. Catch you for the next one. Bye-bye, guys.